The rain was merciless that night. It fell in sheets, beating against the windshield like 1,000 whispered accusations. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water into hazy trails that distorted the lights ahead. I could barely see the road, but I didn't care. My heart was louder than the storm, thundering with the kind of fear only guilt can cause. Every mile I drove brought me closer to something I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but something I knew I had to. If you've ever lost someone because of your own mistakes, someone who once looked at you like you were their whole world, then you'll understand what it feels like to want one more chance. To wish the past could be rewritten, even if just for a moment. Before we go deeper into this story, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need hope today. It really helps more people find stories like this one. Now, let's go back to that night, when I stood in front of the door I once used to call home, drenched, trembling, and not sure what I'd find on the other side. It had been 3 years since I left Clara. 3 years since I'd walked out with a suitcase, too proud to admit I was wrong, too stubborn to stay and fix what I'd broken. We'd been together for 7 years before that, through college, first jobs, countless dreams built in late-night conversations over coffee and cheap pizza. But somewhere along the way, I started changing. My ambition turned into obsession. I wanted success more than peace, validation more than love. Clara had always been the soft voice that brought me back to earth, but I'd stopped listening. When I lost my job and pride crumbled, instead of turning to her, I turned away. I told myself leaving would help me find myself, but really, I was just running. From her disappointment in me, and from the reflection I couldn't bear to see in her eyes anymore. I moved cities, buried myself in meaningless work, and convinced myself she'd move on. But every night, when I came home to silence, I saw her in everything, the mug with chipped paint, the faint scent of jasmine on my pillow, the empty space beside me that no one else could fill. Months turned to years, and guilt turned into longing. When I heard, through a mutual friend, that Clara's mother had passed away, something inside me broke. I should have been there. For her. For the woman who once called me family. Instead, I'd become a ghost in the story of her life. That night, I packed a bag, drove through the storm, and followed the one thing that hadn't changed in 3 years, my heart telling me to go back. When I finally stood at her door, the rain had soaked through my clothes. My hands trembled as I reached for the bell. My mind screamed to turn back, but my heart whispered, knock. So I did. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of slow footsteps. The door creaked open, and there she was, Clara. She looked exactly as I remembered, but different all the same. Her hair was shorter now, tucked behind her ear in a way that made her seem both fragile and strong. Her eyes, those same brown eyes that once read me like an open book, met mine, and I forgot how to breathe. She didn't speak. Neither did I. The rain filled the silence between us until finally, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, she said, "You really came back." Those words hit me harder than any storm ever could. I wanted to fall to my knees right there, to tell her how sorry I was, how I'd thought of her every single day. But my throat closed up, and all I could manage was a quiet nod. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said simply. Inside, everything was the same, and yet not. The old piano still sat near the window, its keys untouched, gathering dust. The wall where we once pinned our travel photos was bare now, just faint outlines where memories used to hang. The house smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something lonely. I stood there dripping onto the carpet, unsure if I should speak or stay quiet. Clara walked to the kitchen, her movements graceful but heavy, like every step carried the weight of something unspoken. She poured 2 cups of tea, just like she used to, and slid one across the table toward me. "Why now?" she finally asked, her eyes never leaving the cup. "After all this time, why did you come back?" I swallowed hard. The truth was tangled somewhere between guilt and fear. Because, I said slowly, I realized I left the only person who ever truly saw me. And I couldn't live with that anymore. She smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. You think time stops waiting for people like you, Ethan? You think you can just walk back in when you're ready? Her words hurt because they were true. I'd expected anger, maybe even hate. But instead, there was only exhaustion in her voice. I wanted to tell her I didn't come expecting forgiveness. I just wanted her to know I was still here, that I hadn't forgotten. We talked for hours, not about love, but about life. About everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. She told me how she'd spent the first few months after I left waiting for a call that never came. How she'd gone through her mother's illness alone, learning how to be strong without me. Every word felt like a blade to my chest, cutting deep with regret. At one point, she looked out the window and said, almost to herself, I thought the hardest part was losing you. But it wasn't. It was realizing you never lost me, you just left me behind. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, but something told me she wasn't ready. So I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence says what words can't. As the night deepened, she stood up, walked to a drawer, and pulled out a small box. Inside was the ring I'd given her years ago, a simple silver band with her initials engraved inside. I couldn't throw it away, she said softly. It reminded me of what used to be good, before everything fell apart. My eyes burned as I looked at it. That tiny ring held a lifetime of memories, of laughter, arguments, dreams we never got to chase. Clara, I whispered, I don't expect you to wear it again. I just want you to know that if I could go back, I'd do everything differently. She nodded, closing the box gently. Maybe you would, she said, but the past isn't a place we can live in forever. Then she looked at me with a faint, bittersweet smile. Still. I'm glad you came back. Those words, simple, quiet, forgiving, were everything I didn't deserve but needed to hear. The clock ticked past midnight. The storm had calmed, and the world outside was washed clean. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the rain fade into a soft drizzle. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no passionate embrace. Just two people sitting across from each other, separated by time, joined by memory. Before I left, she walked me to the door. I turned to her one last time, unsure if I should say goodbye or something more. But she spoke first. You know, she said, some people don't come back. They move on. But maybe, some hearts are meant to circle back home, even if it takes years. I smiled faintly, tears mixing with the last drops of rain. I guess I just didn't know how to stop missing home, I said. She opened the door, the cold air brushing against us. Take care, Ethan, she whispered. I wanted to say I still love you, but I didn't. Because sometimes love isn't about holding on, it's about knowing when to let someone heal. As I stepped out into the night, I realized something. Coming back wasn't about rekindling what once was, it was about closure, about finally forgiving myself for walking away. Maybe, in another life, we'd find each other again. But for now, just hearing her say you really came back was enough to remind me that even the deepest wounds can find peace. And as I looked back one last time, I saw her standing there in the doorway, watching the rain, the faintest smile on her face. It wasn't sadness anymore, it was acceptance. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share this video. It helps more people discover stories of love, loss, and redemption, and reminds them that no matter how far we go, sometimes coming back isn't about fixing the past, but healing from it. Speech balloon before you go, tell me in the comments below, have you ever wanted to go back to someone, not to start over, but to say the words you never got to say? I'd love to read your story. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do, is come back. It was past midnight when the storm began to scream against my window, thunder growling like an angry beast across the sky. I was sitting alone in the half-lit room, the dim glow of the old lamp throwing trembling shadows across the walls. My eyes were fixed on the photograph lying on the table, her smile, frozen in time, still soft, still kind, still haunting. I hadn't seen her in years. I hadn't heard her voice since that night she left, when everything I thought I knew about love and life was shattered in a single heartbeat. The clock struck 12:30 when it happened, the faint sound of footsteps outside my door. My breath caught. Then the door creaked open, and a soft, trembling voice whispered my name. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel, because this story will remind you that even broken hearts can heal when love finds its way back home. I froze, every muscle tightening as if time itself had stopped moving. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it just my imagination? The storm? Or something darker? But then came that whisper again, softer, shakier this time. Ryan. It was her voice. I knew it instantly. It was the kind of voice that used to calm me when the world felt heavy, the voice that once told me she'd never leave, the voice I had convinced myself I'd never hear again. My heart began to pound as I turned toward the door, every nerve alive with disbelief and fear. Standing there in the doorway was her, Emma. She looked pale, rain-soaked, and exhausted, her trembling hands clutching the doorknob as if afraid to let go. Her eyes, still the same shade of deep brown that had once held all my tomorrows, now carried something else, regret, sorrow, and an ache that mirrored my own. I hadn't seen Emma since the night she walked away 5 years ago. Back then, everything between us had crumbled under the weight of misunderstanding, pride, and silence. We'd been inseparable once, two dreamers with too little money but too much hope, building a future from laughter and late-night talks. But when her mother fell ill, and I couldn't be there because I was buried in work trying to save for our wedding, she thought I didn't care. And when I found out she'd left town without even saying goodbye, I thought she never loved me. For years, I carried that wound like a ghost that refused to rest. Now she was standing in front of me, drenched and shaking, looking like she'd walked through hell to reach my door. I wanted to say something, anything, but words refused to form. The only sound was the thunder outside and the rain sliding down her hair, dripping onto the floor between us. She stepped closer, her lips trembling as if she feared I might push her away. And maybe I should have. But all I could do was stare at her, this woman who once held my heart, broke it, and somehow still had the power to make it beat faster than it should. She looked around the room, her gaze falling on the photo of us on the table, the one I had never been able to throw away. A faint smile appeared on her face, weak but real, like a flicker of light in the dark. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "You kept it." And in that small sentence, everything we'd left unsaid over the years came rushing back, the love, the loss, the confusion, the longing. I finally found my voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. "Why are you here, Emma?" I wanted the answer to make sense, to have logic. But her eyes told me before her words did that it wasn't logic that had brought her here, it was pain. She looked down, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks, and said she had nowhere else to go. That her mother was gone now, that the man she married after leaving me had hurt her more than she could bear, that she'd left him tonight and didn't know where else to run. My chest tightened as she spoke. I could see how fragile she was, like a bird that had flown through too many storms. The storm outside raged louder, but inside, a heavier silence fell between us. I wanted to hate her for leaving, to remind her of how long I had waited, how many nights I had sat alone wondering what I'd done wrong. But as I watched her shivering in front of me, every piece of anger I'd held onto began to crumble. Life had already punished her far more than I ever could. Without another word, I took a step forward and wrapped my old coat around her shoulders. Her hands brushed mine, cold as ice but trembling with warmth I hadn't felt in years. She broke down then, crying into her hands as I stood beside her, unsure whether to comfort her or fall apart myself. I made her some tea, the same way she used to like it, 2 spoons of sugar, no milk. The steam filled the small kitchen as she sat quietly, staring at the cup like it was something precious. She told me pieces of her story between sips, how love had turned into control, how promises became chains, and how she finally found the courage to leave. But the worst part wasn't what he did, it was how much she blamed herself for everything. Maybe I deserved it, she said in a whisper that broke me in half. I wanted to tell her no one deserves pain like that, but my throat ached too much to speak. Hours passed in that small kitchen. The storm began to fade, and dawn's first light crept through the window, brushing against her tired face. I hadn't realized how long we'd sat there in silence, 2 broken souls trying to remember how to breathe again. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were softer, clearer, as if some part of her had started to heal just by being there. She told me she didn't expect forgiveness, that she'd understand if I asked her to leave. But something in her voice, something fragile and real, made me realize that sometimes life gives you one small moment to make a choice that changes everything. I could hold on to the pain and let her go again, or I could choose compassion, the same kind she once showed me when I was at my lowest. And so, without thinking too hard, I told her she could stay for the night. Just one night, I said. But deep down, I already knew that one night could never be enough to untangle what still tied us together. That night, as she slept on the couch wrapped in my blanket, I sat awake watching the sunrise spill over the horizon. The storm had washed the world clean, and for the first time in years, my heart felt strangely light. I thought about how easily life can break people apart and how sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, it brings them back together, not because everything is fixed, but because both hearts finally understand the beauty in forgiveness. Days turned into weeks. Emma didn't leave. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that she just needed time to recover. But the truth was, I needed her there too. We spent long evenings talking about the years we lost, the things we should have said but never did. Slowly, the laughter returned, the kind that used to echo through our tiny apartment when we had nothing but each other. She started painting again, and I started writing like I used to before life got in the way. It wasn't love right away, not the same kind we once had. It was something quieter, steadier, a friendship built from ashes. But beneath it all, something gentle was blooming again. Then one evening, as the golden light filled the room, she looked at me and said, "You never stopped loving me, did you?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. The truth was there in the way I looked at her, in the way her hand found mine without hesitation. Life had come full circle, not perfectly, not without scars, but with enough grace to make the pain worth it. Sometimes, the people who leave aren't gone forever. Sometimes, they return not to rewrite the past, but to help you see that love, in its purest form, survives even after everything else fades. It forgives, it rebuilds, it begins again. And when she whispered my name that night, past midnight, she wasn't just calling me, she was calling back a part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. So, if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love can heal, forgive, and find its way home no matter how late it arrives, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need hope tonight, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the soul. Before you go, tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment when someone from your past came back into your life and changed everything? I'd love to hear your story. Because sometimes, the people who are meant to be in our lives don't walk away forever, they just take the long road home. And when they finally arrive, it might just be past midnight, when the door opens, and they whisper your name. It was raining the night I met her, the kind of rain that doesn't just fall but washes away everything you thought you understood about life. I was 21, broke, exhausted, and trying to keep myself afloat in a city that didn't care whether I sank or swam. My shoes were soaked through, my backpack felt heavier than my dreams, and the bus I was waiting for hadn't shown up in half an hour. I remember cursing under my breath, shaking the rain off my jacket when I noticed her, an older woman, maybe in her 40s, struggling to load grocery bags into the trunk of a worn-out silver car. The bags tore under the weight of canned food, sending apples rolling across the wet street. She looked defeated, not just by the rain but by something deeper. I didn't think much of it then, I just ran over and helped her pick up the mess. If you believe that a small act of kindness can change someone's entire life, or even yours, then take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel. Sometimes, stories like this remind us that life's most unexpected turns come from the moments we least expect to matter. Her name was Mira. That night, she thanked me with a soft smile that carried the kind of warmth you only find in someone who has known pain. I thought I'd never see her again. But fate had other plans. The next morning, while I was at the cafe where I worked part-time, she walked in, same calm presence, same weary eyes. She was soaked again, this time from spilled coffee on her coat. She laughed awkwardly and ordered tea. When she looked at me, she recognized me instantly. "You're the boy from last night," she said with that same grateful tone. I just nodded and smiled, not realizing that this woman would soon change everything about my life. Over the next few weeks, Mira started coming to the cafe almost every day. Sometimes she'd just sit by the window, writing in a notebook. Other times, she'd ask me about my classes or how I was managing my rent. I learned that she was a painter, once well known, but now barely managing to sell enough art to pay her bills. Her husband had passed away 3 years earlier in a car accident, and she had been living alone ever since. She told me about how she had lost her passion for painting after his death, how the colors didn't speak to her anymore. I didn't know how to comfort her, but I listened. Maybe that's what she needed most, someone who actually listened. One evening, she mentioned she was moving out of her studio apartment because she couldn't afford it anymore. Something inside me spoke before my brain could catch up. I offered to help her move. She smiled, hesitated, then said yes. That weekend, I found myself carrying boxes filled with canvases, brushes, and memories that smelled of turpentine and loneliness. When we finished, she made tea for both of us. Her apartment was tiny, with cracked walls and flickering lights, but somehow it felt peaceful. As we sat on the floor, surrounded by paintings she hadn't touched in years, she told me something that still echoes in my head. Sometimes, when you lose everything, life gives you someone to help you remember who you are. Helping her out became a routine. I'd fix broken things around her apartment, help her carry groceries, or just sit quietly while she painted. I didn't realize I was becoming part of her healing. Somewhere between my exhaustion and her silence, a strange bond grew. It wasn't romantic, not yet, it was something purer. I admired her resilience, the way she found fragments of beauty even in her pain. She reminded me that life, no matter how cruel, still offers second chances if you have the courage to take them. But people talk. My friends began to joke about me spending too much time with the older woman. My landlord hinted that I should be careful about getting too close. Even my own mother, when she called, asked why I wasn't hanging out with people my own age. I brushed it all off, but somewhere deep down, I started questioning what exactly I was doing. Was I helping her, or was I using her company to escape my own loneliness? The answer came one evening when I found her crying over an old painting. It was a portrait of a man with kind eyes and a faint smile, her late husband. She said she had been trying to finish it for years but couldn't bring herself to. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat next to her. After a long silence, she whispered, "You remind me of him sometimes. Not because you look like him, but because you care the way he used to." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. That night, I stayed until she fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of paint and rain. The next morning, she seemed embarrassed. She thanked me for staying and tried to brush it off, but I could tell something had shifted. From that day on, she looked at me differently, like I wasn't just some boy who helped her move boxes, but someone who had unknowingly walked into her heart. And maybe, just maybe, I had. Months passed. Mira started painting again, her studio filling with life and color. She even sold a few pieces at a local exhibition, her first in years. When she smiled that night, surrounded by people admiring her work, I realized I had never seen her look more alive. She thanked me in front of everyone, calling me her little miracle. My heart swelled with pride and confusion. I didn't know whether to smile or cry. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late evening, the sky painted in shades of gold and sorrow. I had come to help her fix a broken shelf, but she seemed distant, distracted. When I asked if something was wrong, she just stared at me for a long time before finally speaking. "Wasim," she said softly, "would you marry a woman twice your age?" For a moment, I thought she was joking. I laughed awkwardly, waiting for her to smile back. But she didn't. Her eyes were serious, trembling with fear and hope. The room fell silent. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. She looked down, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I know it sounds crazy. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I don't want to ruin that. But I can't pretend I don't feel something real. You've brought me back to life, Wasim. And I don't know how to go back to who I was before you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, images of her laughter, her pain, the nights we spent talking about life and loss. She wasn't just an older woman. She was someone who had taught me more about love, courage, and kindness than anyone my age ever could. But marriage? That word carried weight I wasn't ready to lift. I told her I needed time to think, and she nodded, tears filling her eyes as she whispered, "Of course. Take all the time you need." For days, I couldn't sleep. My friends would never understand. Society would judge. My own parents would be horrified. But in the quiet moments, when I remembered the way she smiled at her paintings again, or how she made tea exactly the way I liked it, my heart whispered what my mind refused to accept: I loved her. I went back to her apartment a week later. She was sitting by the window, painting the sunset. I could tell she had been crying. Without saying a word, I walked up to her, took her paintbrush, and dipped it into gold. Then I said, "If love has an age, then maybe I was born just in time to find yours." She froze, her hand trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. And then she smiled, a smile that carried years of pain, healing, and hope. We didn't rush into anything. We didn't tell anyone. For months, we just existed quietly, painting, laughing, living. Love grew slowly, beautifully, like a garden finally getting sunlight after years of darkness. People still whispered, but we stopped listening. The world had opinions, but we had each other. A year later, under a sky streaked with soft pink clouds, we got married in her backyard. It was small, just a few friends, a few flowers, and two souls who had refused to give up on life. I remember her hands shaking as she held mine, whispering, "Thank you for helping me live again." I smiled and said, "You helped me, too." Sometimes I wonder what people see when they look at us. Maybe they see a young man and an older woman defying convention. But I know what I see, a love that wasn't born out of impulse or lust, but compassion. The kind of love that comes once in a lifetime, if you're lucky enough to recognize it. Life wasn't easy after that. We faced judgment, gossip, even isolation. But love has a way of silencing the noise. Mira started gaining recognition again, her paintings began to sell around the world. And every time someone complimented her art, she'd smile and say, "It's all because someone believed in me when I stopped believing in myself." Years later, when she fell ill, I stayed by her side just as I had that first night in the rain. I held her hand, whispering stories and memories until her breathing grew faint. Before she left, she looked at me with the same tender eyes and whispered, "Promise me you'll keep painting life in colors, even when I'm gone." I nodded through my tears, and she smiled one last time. Today, her paintings hang in galleries, her name whispered with admiration by people who never knew her story. But I do. Every brushstroke tells a story of second chances, of a boy who helped a woman rediscover her soul, and found his own in the process. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's keep spreading love, kindness, and hope to those who think it's too late to begin again. And before you go, tell me in the comments. Would you marry someone who taught you how to love again, even if the world didn't understand? The rain was coming down hard that morning, the kind that makes the world look blurry and fragile, as if everything could dissolve if you stared too long. I stood under the small canopy outside the cafe, soaked halfway despite my umbrella, wondering how my life had fallen apart so quickly. My job was gone, my apartment lease was ending, and the girl I thought would stay forever had left a simple text saying she needed space. I was 29 and felt like a ghost drifting through a life that no longer recognized me. I didn't come to the cafe for the coffee, I came because it was warm, quiet, and no one there expected me to smile. But that day, that gray, unremarkable Thursday, something changed. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the unexpected ways life brings people together, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this reach more hearts. I pushed open the cafe door, the bell above it ringing softly, and the smell of roasted beans hit me, that comforting, almost nostalgic scent that somehow makes broken hearts beat a little slower. Behind the counter stood a girl I hadn't seen before. Her hair was tied in a loose ponytail, a few strands falling messily around her face, and her eyes, warm, curious, quietly alive, met mine with a small, polite smile. "Cold day, huh?" she said, in that easy tone people use when they're used to making strangers feel seen. I just nodded, muttered my usual order, black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and fished for the last few coins I had. She noticed my hesitation when I realized I was short by a few rupees. "Don't worry about it," she said, waving it off with a light laugh. "First coffee's on the house for new faces." I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. I just took my cup, nodded awkwardly, and sat by the window, watching the rain wash the street clean. But my eyes kept wandering back to her. The way she smiled genuinely at everyone, the way she hummed softly when no one was listening, the way she seemed to carry sunlight even in that dim, rainy space. There was something strangely grounding about her presence, like a reminder that not everyone was rushing, not everyone was pretending. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to that cafe more often than I meant to. I told myself it was for the quiet, the warmth, but deep down, I knew it was because of her. Her name was Amina. She had this gentle kindness that never felt forced. She'd ask how I was doing, and unlike most people, she'd actually wait for an answer. When I told her about losing my job, she didn't give me empty advice, she just said, "It's okay." Sometimes the universe needs you to pause before it gives you what's next. It was such a simple line, but it stayed with me. I started to talk more. She listened. I told her about my failed relationship, my regrets, my fear of starting over. She shared pieces of her own life too, growing up in a small town, moving to the city to chase dreams that hadn't quite worked out yet. But unlike me, she still believed in trying. She talked about painting, how she wanted to open her own small art cafe someday. There was something about her belief in beauty that made me feel like maybe I hadn't lost everything after all. Weeks went by, and our small conversations became the best part of my mornings. I started helping her carry supplies in, fix the flickering cafe light, and even wash dishes when the place got too busy. The owner didn't mind, he liked having extra hands, and I liked feeling useful again. Amina would joke that I should ask for a job there, but I always laughed it off. The truth was, I didn't want to ruin what we had by turning it into something ordinary. Then one afternoon, as I sat near the window again, watching her wipe the counter with her usual grace, she suddenly looked up and caught my gaze. Her smile that day was different. Softer, almost shy. When I went to the counter to pay, she handed me my cup with her usual cheerful, "Here you go," but there was something written on it this time. A faint line of black ink along the side. I didn't notice until I stepped outside, the wind cold against my face. Her handwriting was neat, small, almost uncertain. "If you ever need to talk again, or just need someone to remind you it's okay, call me," smiley face. 03XX. I froze. My heart did something it hadn't done in months, it raced. She didn't owe me anything. She wasn't flirting, I knew that. It was something deeper. Something kind. Something that felt like hope written on a coffee cup. That night, I stared at that cup for hours. I thought about texting her, calling her, thanking her. But fear whispered in my ear, fear of misreading kindness again, fear of ruining another good thing. So I didn't. I just kept the cup by my bedside, like a strange little token of comfort. Days turned into weeks. The cafe became busier, and sometimes she wasn't there when I came. When she was, we talked, but something had shifted. There was a quiet understanding between us now, a connection built on shared silences more than words. She never mentioned the number, and neither did I. But one evening, when I came in late, the cafe almost empty, I saw her sitting alone, staring out at the rain. Her eyes were red, and her smile, that beautiful, effortless smile, was gone. I sat beside her without saying a word. After a while, she whispered, "My dad passed away last week." I didn't even get to say goodbye. Her voice cracked, and I felt the ache in every syllable. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. I just sat there, letting her cry quietly, her hand resting near mine on the table. In that moment, something shifted again, not romance, not pity, but a deep, aching understanding between two broken people trying to find meaning in a world that often forgets to be gentle. After that day, we grew closer. I finally found the courage to call her, not because of the number, but because I wanted her to know she wasn't alone either. We started talking outside the cafe, late-night walks, long talks about life and art and loss. I learned she'd been taking care of her younger brother since her father's illness, working extra shifts, sacrificing her own dreams quietly. And yet, she still smiled. Still believed. I realized then that she wasn't just being friendly that day, she was offering light to someone she saw drowning. And now, somehow, I wanted to return that light. One evening, I told her I wanted to help her open that art cafe she always dreamed of. I didn't have money, but I had time, ideas, and a will to build again. We started small, painting old furniture, collecting used cups, sketching designs on napkins. The owner of the cafe gave us his blessing to use the back room for her artwork. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Slowly, it became something beautiful, walls filled with colors, shelves lined with hand-painted cups, laughter echoing where silence once lived. Months passed. The little cafe corner became a small local favorite. People came not just for coffee, but for warmth, for the stories painted on the walls. And every time I saw Amina smiling behind the counter, a brush tucked behind her ear, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. One morning, before opening time, I found a new cup on the counter. My name written across it in her neat handwriting. Beneath it, a single line. "You never called that day. But I'm glad you finally did." That was when I realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes, people come into your life disguised as kindness. You think they're just being friendly, but in truth, they're the bridge between who you were and who you can become again. Life didn't magically fix itself. I still struggled. We both did. But we learned to build from the broken pieces. Together. She painted, I managed, and the cafe slowly became a place where lost souls found warmth, just like I once had. A year later, we held the opening of Cup of Second Chances, a name she insisted on. People laughed at it, found it sentimental, but for us, it was perfect. Because that's exactly what she gave me, a second chance. Not just at love, but at life. And sometimes, when the cafe closes and the night grows quiet, she'll still hand me a cup, smiling like she did that first day, and say, "Still black, no sugar?" And I'll smile back, knowing that behind those simple words lives 1,000 unspoken moments that changed everything. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever been reminded that a small act of kindness can change a life, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this are written to remind us all that love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it's written quietly on a paper cup. Sparkle's special request: before you leave, comment below and tell me, have you ever met someone who reminded you that goodness still exists? Because sometimes, it only takes one stranger's smile, one small act, one message on a cup, to make you believe in life again. Red Heart.
She warned me. I locked my door at midnight. I smiled and said, "Then I guess I'll be there by 11. I didn't know then how one teasing line would turn into the quietest, slowest, most forbidden kind of closeness I've ever felt. It was a little past 9 when I pulled into the driveway, thinking I'd catch up with my best friend. The house was quiet, lights soft and scattered, not the usual weekend energy I expected. Instead, I found his mother in the garden, kneeling beside a row of late-blooming roses, her hands gently brushing the petals as if they were something fragile she didn't want to rush. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. A light cardigan wrapped loosely around her shoulders, the sleeves pushed up just far enough to reveal the soft lines of her wrists. There was a smudge of soil near her thumb and a small, knowing smile on her lips. "He's not home," she said, standing and brushing her hands on her jeans. "But you can come in if you like." I hesitated, a polite protest on the tip of my tongue, but she was already leading the way toward the porch. The evening air smelled faintly of jasmine and fresh earth, the kind of scent that makes you slow down without realizing it. She poured tea, mint, the kind that lingers cool against your throat, and we sat beneath the warm porch light as crickets sang somewhere in the hedges. We talked about small things, her garden, my new job, how fast summer was slipping away. But somewhere between her laugh, quiet, genuine, and the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup, I felt that strange awareness of time slowing down. It wasn't anything she said. It was the way she listened, the way her eyes stayed on mine a moment too long before looking back to the garden. When the conversation drifted toward how late she often stayed up tending to her plants, she laughed lightly and said, "But I always locked my door at midnight." Habit, I guess. Something in me, maybe the part that had always admired her quiet strength, answered before I could think twice. "Then I'll be there by 11. It was a harmless tease, or at least that's what I told myself. But the words hung in the air like a thread neither of us wanted to pull just yet. She looked at me, eyebrows raised, and for a heartbeat there was something unreadable in her gaze, not scandalized, not offended, just curious. She shook her head, smiling as she rose to take the cups inside. "You've grown bold," she said softly. "Careful with that." I watched her disappear through the door, the screen door creaking softly behind her, and felt a warmth settle somewhere in my chest, not from the tea, but from the quiet shift that had just begun. The days that followed carried the kind of quiet rhythm that doesn't announce itself, it just unfolds. I found myself stopping by her place more often than usual. At first, it was for practical reasons, dropping off a book I borrowed, picking up a jacket I'd left in the living room, asking if my friend had returned. But each time, the door opened, and there she was, her smile soft, her eyes carrying that calm weight of someone who had lived enough to find beauty in unhurried things. One evening, the sky was a pale gold, the kind that dips gently into night. I saw her struggling with a grocery bag at the bottom of the steps, the weight of it tugging at her wrist. Without thinking, I crossed the driveway and reached for it. Our fingers met, hers cool from the evening air, mine warm from the steering wheel, and for a second either of us let go. "Thank you," she murmured, a faint crease forming at the edge of her smile as if gratitude was something she didn't say often enough. Inside, the house smelled faintly of rosemary and something baking, a slow, homely aroma that wrapped around the space like a soft shawl. She set the groceries down and offered me tea, as she always did. And somehow, what should have been a 2-minute visit stretched into an hour, then more. We talked about the little things that people often skip over. Her work. The plants on her windowsill. How she always kept a book open on the kitchen counter, reading between chores. And in those small, ordinary exchanges, I noticed the things I'd never really paid attention to before. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the small sigh she made when the kettle clicked, the warmth in her voice when she said my name. There was a moment, quiet, fleeting, when I reached across the table to hand her the book she'd left nearby. Our hands brushed, fingertips catching for just a breath too long. Neither of us spoke about it, but her eyes flicked up, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw something there. Not a confession, not a promise, just awareness. As I left that evening, she stood at the doorway, her cardigan wrapped around her shoulders again. "Drive safe," she said. It was simple, almost casual. But her tone carried something I couldn't quite name, like she was already thinking about the next time I'd come by, even if either of us had planned it. And me? I drove away with the faint taste of mint tea still on my tongue and the memory of her fingers brushing mine like a quiet echo in the dark. The rain started early that afternoon, the kind that comes steady and sure, tapping softly against the windows until the whole house seemed wrapped in its hush. I hadn't planned to stop by, but I was already driving past, and something about the warm glow through her kitchen window drew me in. She was at the counter when I stepped inside, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a loose sweater hanging over one shoulder, steam rising from the mug in her hands. The room smelled like coffee and rain-soaked earth, a combination so familiar it made me pause at the doorway just to take it in. "You're becoming a regular," she said with a faint smile, not unkindly. There was no accusation in her tone, but the words hung between us with a quiet kind of weight. I shrugged lightly, trying to keep it casual. "Maybe I just like your coffee." She chuckled, that soft, low sound I'd started to wait for, and handed me a clean mug. As I took it, our fingers touched again, brief but warm, a thread pulling tight between us before either of us let go. We sat across from each other as the rain patted the glass, our conversation slower than usual, like the weather had pressed pause on the rest of the world. Somewhere between talking about work and her son's return next week, her voice shifted. Softer. More deliberate. "You know this, you and I talking like this, it's harmless," she began, eyes on her mug, not me. "But people see things differently. You're his friend. There are lines, whether they're real or imagined, they exist." I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I reached for the towel beside her, gently drying the cup she just rinsed. Our hands met again, this time over the damp porcelain, lingering a heartbeat too long. "I know," I said finally. "I just think sometimes, the lines people draw, they don't see what's actually there." Her eyes lifted to mine then, steady, searching, not angry but conflicted. For a moment either of us moved, and the sound of the rain filled the space between words. She exhaled, not in frustration, but in something closer to surrender. "You have this way of making simple things sound dangerous," she murmured. I smiled faintly, setting the towel down. Or maybe they were never that simple to begin with. We didn't speak of it again that evening. She asked about my plans for the weekend. I teased her about the stubborn window latch, and when I left, the rain had turned to mist, clinging cool and fine against my skin. But as I walked back to my car, I could still feel the ghost of her fingers against mine. Not quite a promise, not yet a goodbye. Just a quiet reminder that something had shifted. Whether or not we dared to name it. It was the kind of evening that felt too still, like the world had already gone to bed. I had come over to help with that stubborn window latch in the den, the one that always caught halfway and refused to budge. My friend was still out of town, and I told myself it was just a favor, just another evening spent doing something small and practical. She was waiting with a lamp lit low, its warm glow pooling on the wooden floor, throwing soft shadows on the walls. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and something subtle in her perfume, a scent that felt both familiar and new, like a memory you can't quite place. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, handing me a small set of tools. "It's silly, but I never trust the cold drafts this time of year." I knelt by the window, working the latch as she stood nearby, one hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair, the other wrapped around herself as though she couldn't decide if she was cold or simply uncertain. We talked as I worked, about nothing in particular at first. The weather, the trip her son was on, the book she was trying to finish. But the silences between words felt heavier tonight, as though they were holding something we hadn't quite said. When I finally got the latch to click into place, I turned to find her watching me. Not just looking, watching. Her expression was soft, unreadable, and when she spoke, her voice had a texture to it I hadn't heard before. "You know, it's been a long time since anyone paid attention like this," she said, almost like she was confessing it to the room, not to me. "Not just the big things, anyone can do that, but the little things. Noticing when a window sticks. Bringing tea without asking. Remembering." I didn't know what to say at first. Her words settled into the air like the light from that lamp, gentle, but warm enough to feel. She stepped closer, fingers brushing a curl of hair behind her ear, and for the briefest moment, her hand found my forearm. Not an accident this time. Not the passing brush of a grocery bag or a teacup. A deliberate, quiet touch. Her skin was warm, her palm light, but I felt it like a pulse beneath my sleeve. "Sometimes I wonder if I've made myself too comfortable being alone," she said softly, her gaze still on her fingers resting there. "It's easier than being disappointed." I met her eyes, steady and unhurried. "Or maybe you've just been waiting for the right kind of company." She let out a breath, part laugh, part something else, and stepped back, as if to protect the balance we both pretended we hadn't tipped. "Tea?" she asked, her voice returning to its familiar steadiness. "Tea," I said, even though either of us was thinking about tea anymore. The night before his return carried a strange, quiet energy, the kind that lingers in the corners of a room, reminding you that something is about to shift. I told myself I was only stopping by to drop off a borrowed jacket, but I stayed. Maybe we both knew I would. She had already set the table when I arrived. A simple meal, pasta with olive oil and herbs, a bottle of red wine breathing quietly beside 2 glasses. The house felt warmer than usual, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. "You didn't have to cook," I said, easing into the chair across from her. "It's just pasta," she replied, but there was a faint curve to her lips, something between a smile and an unspoken thought. Dinner moved slowly, like every word was a thread carefully placed. We talked about her son, about the trip he'd be coming back from, about my work. But beneath the words was a pulse, a steady, unspoken rhythm neither of us named. Every so often, her gaze flicked to the clock in the hallway, its hands inching toward the hour that had become our quiet landmark. At one point, I reached for the wine, fingers brushing hers as she steadied the bottle. It wasn't an accident this time, not entirely. The warmth of her skin lingered against mine, and though either of us moved away, we also didn't speak about it. The conversation dipped into softer territory after that. How strange it is to miss company you never expected to enjoy. How nights can feel longer when the house is too quiet. Her voice lowered as she spoke, and I realized her glass was still half full, her fingers tracing its rim like she wasn't ready to finish it yet. "You remember what I said, don't you?" she asked suddenly, her eyes catching mine over the table. "About locking your door?" I said, a slow smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. She nodded, looking away briefly before meeting my gaze again. "It's silly, really. Just a habit. But somehow it feels like a line." The clock ticked in the hall. The space between us felt narrower than it looked, 2 hands apart, maybe less. "I remember," I said quietly. "And I haven't forgotten what I said either." Her breath caught, not dramatically, just enough to shift the air. She didn't scold, didn't pull back. Instead, she reached for her glass, the motion smooth, controlled, but I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she lifted it. After dinner, we didn't make plans. She gathered the plates, I helped without being asked, and when I left that night, the clock was still shy of midnight. The porch light hummed faintly, casting a pale circle at my feet. She stood at the doorway, cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, watching as I stepped off the porch. "Good night," she said, but it sounded more like not yet. The night air carried that late summer chill, the kind that brushes along your collar and makes every sound seem sharper. It was exactly 11 when I found myself standing at her door, not knocking yet, not texting, just standing there with the porch light humming above me and the memory of her words looping in my head. For a moment, I thought about leaving. About how easy it would be to step back into my car, drive off, and let this strange thread between us unravel before it knotted into something neither of us could ignore. But my hand rose anyway, one slow, steady knock. She opened the door without surprise. Her hair was loose, brushing her shoulders, and her robe was tied softly at her waist. Not tightly. Just enough to suggest comfort, not defense. "You're early," she said, and though her lips tried to shape it as a joke, her voice was quiet, a little caught between relief and something more careful. "I said I'd be here by 11, I replied. "And I keep my word." For a moment, we stood in the doorway, the cool night pressing at my back and the warm hush of her house opening in front of me. She stepped aside slowly, letting me in, the sound of the door closing behind me softer than I expected. The house was dimly lit, one lamp in the living room, a faint glow spilling from the kitchen. She moved ahead of me, her slippers whispering on the hardwood. "Tea?" she asked, her hands already reaching for the kettle, perhaps to give them something to do. "Yes," I said, even though I wasn't here for tea. "Not really." As she set the cups down, I noticed the small tremor in her fingers, not fear, more like the weight of a decision still balancing itself. Her shoulders brushed mine as she passed, just lightly enough to make it feel deliberate. Neither of us moved away. We sat at the kitchen table again, just like all the other evenings, yet nothing about it felt the same. The clock in the hallway ticked toward midnight with a patience that felt almost cruel. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually come," she said finally, her fingers wrapped around the teacup though she hadn't sipped yet. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "But some things don't go away just because we pretend they should." Her lips parted slightly, not to answer, but because the words seemed to land where silence usually lived between us. She looked at me then, really looked, and the question in her eyes wasn't about propriety anymore. It was about what this might become if either of us let it. The kettle clicked again as it cooled. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on the damp street. Midnight was close now. The door wasn't locked yet. And neither of us had made a move, but we both knew we already had. The clock in the hallway chimed softly, 12 strokes that felt less like an ending and more like a question lingering in the air. Midnight. The hour she had always mentioned. The hour I was never meant to cross. And yet, here I was, sitting beside her on the couch, the faint hum of the kettle still drifting from the kitchen, the world outside quiet and damp from the earlier rain. She had locked the door after I stepped in, not against me, but with me inside. The soft click of the bolt had been strangely grounding, like a line drawn not to keep something out, but to keep a moment safe. A light blanket rested over our knees, the kind you pull down when you're not planning to stay long but end up doing so anyway. Her head found its way to my shoulder, slowly, carefully, as though testing if the space was truly there for her to rest. I didn't move. My arm rested across the backrest, not quite around her, but near enough that the warmth from her hair reached my sleeve. We didn't speak for a while. The silence wasn't heavy, it was steady, warm, and oddly forgiving. The kind that comes when two people finally stop pretending they haven't noticed each other. "You should know," she said eventually, voice low. "I never planned for this. I didn't expect to want company like this again." I turned slightly, catching the faint curve of her cheek in the lamp's glow. "Neither did I," I admitted. But sometimes the things we don't plan are the ones that make the most sense. She gave a soft laugh, tired maybe, but not unhappy. Her hand shifted under the blanket until it rested gently against mine. No grasp, no claim, just touch. Warm, quiet, unspoken. "I'm not asking for anything," she murmured. "No promises. Just something real. Even if it's only this moment. That's all I want too," I said. And I meant it. We sat like that for what felt like a long time, the clock ticking softly past 12, the house wrapped in a kind of peace I hadn't known it could hold. There was no urgency, no grand confession waiting to break the stillness. Just her leaning a little closer, my shoulder easing toward hers, the night folding gently around us. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door, her hand brushing my arm as she passed. "Drive safe," she said, the same words as always, but warmer now, threaded with something that felt like trust. At the doorway, she paused, fingers on the lock. "Maybe some doors," she said quietly, "aren't meant to stay closed forever." I smiled, the kind that doesn't need words. "Then I'm glad I was here before midnight." The door clicked behind me, not an ending, just the sound of a night that had chosen to stay with us both.